Okay, so get this right. We got this letter. It's addressed to Vice President Kamala Harris.
Okay.
And it's dated November 15th, 2024. The writer, his name's Steven Spoonamore, he's claiming that the 2024 presidential election was hacked.
Wow.
And he's like urging Harris to demand hand recounts across the board.
So what's really interesting here is that Spoonamore isn't just some like random guy off the street, you know?
Right.
This guy's got some serious credentials in the tech world.
Yeah.
Like we're talking former CEO, CTO, experience with big agencies like the DoD and Homeland Security. He even gave a keynote at the National Counter Intel Summit.
Yeah, no, this guy's, he's not messing around. He's definitely not a newbie when it comes to like security and stuff like that.
Certainly not.
And he comes right out and says, like, there are multiple really clear signs that the presidential vote was deliberately messed with. He actually believes that the election results were manipulated enough to like change the outcome. And get this, he even says that a hand recount would probably show that Harris actually won.
So that brings up a big question right off the bat. Even if we assume, you know, just for the sake of argument that Spoonamore's right, how do we make sure any investigation into these potential problems, whether they're statistical or whatever, how do we make sure it's done right without, you know, just fueling more conspiracy theories?
Yeah, that's a good point. It's definitely a tricky situation.
That's a tough balance.
Yeah. So what evidence is he using to back up these claims? They're pretty bold.
Right. So he talks about these things he calls bullet ballots.
Okay.
And these are votes that were only cast for Trump, like no other selections were made on the ballot.
Oh, okay.
And he's talking about a massive number of them, like around 600,000.
Yeah.
And they're all concentrated in those 7 swing states, remember? According to him, this is something you just don't see in the other states. Okay, but couldn't those be from, like, people who only care about the president? You know, they just don't care about the other races.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
And that's something investigators would definitely need to consider.
Right.
But Spoonamore argues that the sheer number of these bullet ballots, especially in those key swing states, it's just way more than you'd expect from just, you know, single issue voters.
Yeah.
He actually gives some specific examples to show the difference.
Like what?
Well, he compares Arizona and Nevada, which were really close races, remember?
Yeah.
To their neighbors like Idaho, Oregon, and Utah.
Okay.
In Arizona, over 7% of the votes for Trump were bullet ballots. And in Nevada, it was over 5%. But in Idaho, Oregon, and Utah, which all have a lot of Trump supporters too, bullet ballots were less than, get this, 0.1% of his total votes.
Okay, yeah, I see what you mean. That's a pretty big difference. Exactly. And he even highlights how in Arizona, Michigan, North Carolina, and Wisconsin, the number of these bullet ballots was actually enough to have flipped the outcome in each of those states.
Wow. So he's basically saying that those votes were purposely added to give Trump just enough of a lead to avoid a recount.
That's his argument, yeah. He thinks those votes weren't real, they were manipulated. He even says that in those 4 states, after you take out those bullet ballots, Trump's margin of victory was always just a tiny bit above the number that would trigger an automatic recount.
Yeah. Almost like someone was trying to like sneak it in, you know?
Yeah.
So how's he saying they did this? Like, was it some super complicated, you know, like Mission Impossible type of thing?
Actually, he says it wouldn't need to be that complicated.
Oh, okay.
He thinks someone with like decent programming skills, access to like not even that many voting machines and a team of maybe 10 people could have pulled it off.
Okay, so break it down for me. How could this hack have actually happened? I know he talks about 2 possible ways.
He does. His first theory is that they manipulated the voting data digitally.
Okay.
He's saying someone could have electronically added votes to the e-poll books. Those are the electronic voter registration lists, basically.
Right.
And then also to the totals on the voting machines themselves.
Okay, so hold on. What exactly are these e-poll books? Like, how do they work in the whole voting process?
So they're like digital versions of those old paper voter rolls.
Got it.
They have all the info about registered voters, their names, addresses, and whether they've voted or not.
Okay.
Election officials use them to manage voter registration, check people in at the polls, and keep track of who's voted.
Got it. So is Spoonamore saying hackers could have added fake voters to these e-poll books?
Yeah.
And then made it look like those fake voters cast ballots for Trump?
Exactly.
But wouldn't that be super obvious if there was a hand recount? Like, wouldn't those votes get flagged because there'd be no actual paper ballots to match them?
Right. That's exactly why Spoonamore thinks this method, if they used it, would be exposed really quickly by a hand recount.
Okay.
There wouldn't be any paper trail to back up those electronic votes.
Makes sense. So what about the second theory?
His second theory is a little more complex.
Okay.
He thinks hackers could have combined this e-poll book manipulation with actual ballot stuffing or substitution at those tabulation centers.
Oh.
You know, where they count the votes.
Yeah. So they need someone on the inside to help them with that?
Potentially, yeah. He points to Maricopa County in Arizona as a possible place where this could have happened.
Okay.
Because of the really high number of bullet ballots there.
Right.
So they would create fake entries in those e-poll books.
Yeah.
Mark those fake voters as having voted for Trump, and then make sure there were physical ballots to match those fake entries when they counted the votes.
So this way would be harder to catch.
It would be more challenging, for sure.
Okay.
It would require a very thorough hand recount. Okay.
And you'd need to cross-reference the ballots with the e-poll book data.
Got it. Okay, but is this kind of stuff even possible, technically? I mean, voting systems are supposed to be secure, right?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
How secure are they, really?
Yeah.
And what's being done to stop this kind of tampering?
It's interesting, right? Because on one hand, you have Spoonamore, who's worked with the government on security stuff.
Right.
And he's saying these systems might be more vulnerable than we think.
Right. And then on the other hand, you have election officials who insist that the systems are secure.
Right.
And that they have safeguards in place to prevent this kind of fraud.
Yeah.
It's a debate, for sure.
It's a debate, yeah. And it definitely makes you wonder about, like, how secure these systems really are and whether we need more transparency and oversight. You know?
Absolutely.
Okay, but let's get back to Spoonamore's letter. He doesn't stop there.
Right.
He actually brings up Elon Musk's pledge to vote lottery. Oh, yeah, the one where he was giving away all that money to get people to vote?
Yeah, that one. So Spoonamore is saying that the data Musk's campaign collected, like specifically the addresses of people who pledged to vote for Trump, could have been used to make lists of ghost voters, people who never actually voted, but whose votes were added illegally.
So, hold on. He's saying they had a list of names and addresses to create those fake entries in the e-poll books.
Yeah. And since those e-poll books are often online, Spoonamore thinks Musk's team could have been watching them in real time throughout Election Day, maybe even using things like Starlink to keep track of who was voting.
Wow.
So they'd know which people who pledged didn't actually show up to vote, and they could mark those people as having cast bullet ballots for Trump.
Okay, that's a pretty big accusation.
Yeah. Wouldn't using data from Musk's campaign like that be, like, insanely risky?
It would be, yeah.
You'd think someone would have noticed or said something?
You would think so. But Spoonamore is convinced that if this is what happened, investigators need to start with those programmers who worked on Musk's campaign.
So he's saying follow the data trail.
Basically, yeah. See where it leads. But here's where it gets even weirder. Spoonamore brings up those bomb threats that happened at some of the tabulation centers.
Bomb threats.
Yeah.
Like with real bombs.
That's what he's suggesting. He thinks those threats might have been planned to mess up the chain of custody for the ballots.
Oh, so to create chaos and make it harder to keep track of the ballot.
Exactly. And then if anyone ever demanded a recount, they could say that the chain of custody was broken.
Yeah.
Which would make the recount unreliable.
Hold on. Back up for a second. What does chain of custody mean, like in this context?
So it's basically the process of carefully documenting how those ballots are handled.
Okay.
From the moment they're cast to when they're counted.
Right.
It's super important for making sure the election is fair. So if the chain of custody is broken, it means there's a chance those ballots could have been messed with.
Got it. Okay, so Spoonamore's saying those bomb threats might have been part of a bigger plan to make any recount seem shady?
Yeah, that's his theory.
Okay, this is starting to sound like a spy movie or something.
It's a pretty wild scenario for sure. But remember, these are just allegations, not proven facts.
Right. We got to be careful about jumping to conclusions.
Exactly.
But his claims are definitely, they're definitely interesting, you know?
Definitely.
So, what does Spoonamore want Harris to do with all this?
Well, he's pretty clear about what he wants her to do. He wants her to use her authority to demand hand recounts in all those places where they saw these weird things happening.
So he's putting the responsibility on her, basically.
Yeah, he ends the letter by saying, "This is all I can do."
So where do we go from here? Like, what does all this mean?
What's the big question, isn't it?
It is. It's a big one.
Yeah.
This deep dive has given us a lot to think about. And we've only just started to scratch the surface, really.
Yeah. This letter from Spoonamore, it really makes you wonder about, like, how secure the 2024 election actually was.
Yeah, it's kind of wild to think that someone could maybe mess with the results on such a big scale.
It is a little unsettling, especially given his background, you know?
Right.
Like, he's not just some random person making stuff up.
He's definitely not, yeah. He's got, like, actual evidence.
Yeah.
He lays out those statistical anomalies, the methods they could use, and even suggests specific things to investigate.
And he even compares this whole thing to that real-world example, you know? That case with those devices intended for Hamas that were intercepted and rigged with spyware and even explosives.
Oh, yeah, that's right. He said if they could pull that off, messing with electronic voting systems would be easy in comparison.
Exactly. He's saying the hack he's describing wouldn't need the same level of skill or resources.
Which makes it even scarier, right?
It does.
Because it means that interfering with our elections might not be as hard as we thought.
It definitely raises some big questions about our voting systems and whether we need to completely rethink security.
Absolutely. Okay, but let's say, just for the sake of argument, that Spoonamore is right. What would that mean?
I mean, if his claims are actually true, it could be a huge constitutional crisis.
Yeah, think about the fallout if it turned out the election results were deliberately changed like that.
It would destroy people's trust in the whole system, right? Wow. It could even lead to demands for a new election.
And what about legally? Could people who did something like this get in trouble?
Oh, for sure. If there's evidence of intentional tampering, you're talking criminal investigations, prosecutions, the whole 9 yards. We could be talking about charges of election fraud, conspiracy, maybe even national security violations, depending on who's involved.
So this is serious business.
It's huge.
It's not just about this one election.
Exactly. This is about the core of our democracy.
It makes you wonder about the future of elections, you know.
It does.
What if we don't fix these problems?
Yeah. That's the million-dollar question.
It is. So Spoonamore says one thing we need to do is have thorough hand recounts in the states where those anomalies were found.
He's got a point there. Hand recounts, especially the kind where you check the actual ballots against those e-poll book records, they'd be really important for making sure those vote totals are accurate.
And he's putting the pressure on Vice President Harris to make those recounts happen.
Right. He thinks she's in a unique position to get that process started.
But even with hand recounts, wouldn't it be super hard to prove that someone actually manipulated things? I mean, how do you even trace something like that?
It wouldn't be easy, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But it's not impossible. They could do forensic analysis on the voting machines.
Right.
Look for anything weird in the e-poll book data.
Okay.
Try to find out if anyone at those tabulation centers was involved. It'd be a massive investigation.
Huge.
But it would be crucial.
It's clear that something needs to be done.
Yeah.
We can't just ignore this.
Absolutely not. Free and fair elections are essential for a democracy.
It's a little scary to think that something like our right to vote could be at risk like this.
It is. It highlights the need for being vigilant, having strong security measures, and being transparent with elections.
We have to make sure every single vote is counted right.
Absolutely.
And that the results actually reflect what people want.
That's the foundation of a democracy.
Well said. This is all very thought-provoking. Spoonamore's letter doesn't just raise questions about what might have happened. It makes you think about all sorts of new questions, like, if this was planned, who was behind it?
Right.
Why did they do it? And how did they keep it a secret for so long?
Those are questions that deserve answers.
Yeah.
You have to follow the evidence wherever it leads.
Right.
Analyze those digital footprints and get to the truth.
Like a giant puzzle with missing pieces.
It is. And until we find those pieces, this cloud of uncertainty is going to hang over the 2024 election.
And future elections too, probably.
That's the real worry, right? If this happened in 2024, what's to stop it from happening again?
So what can we do as, like, regular people to protect our right to vote?
Yeah.
I mean, besides staying informed and stuff.
Well, the most important thing is to hold our elected officials accountable. Yeah. They're the ones who are supposed to be protecting the integrity of our elections.
So putting pressure on them to make those systems more secure.
Right.
Investigating any credible claims of fraud.
Absolutely.
Basically, making sure our votes are actually being counted fairly.
That's the key. We can't just sit back and assume everything's fine.
Right.
Our democracy depends on us being active and engaged.
This whole thing really makes you think.
It does. It challenges our assumptions about elections.
Yeah.
How they work, how secure they are.
We tend to think of hacking as something that happens in movies, not something that could actually change who becomes president.
Right. But Spoonamore's letter forces us to face the reality that our systems are more vulnerable than we might realize.
So what can we do to make sure our elections are safe from this kind of interference in the future?
Well, Spoonamore was really adamant about hand recounts.
Right.
He sees them as a vital way to double-check those electronic vote totals, especially when there are signs of possible manipulation.
And it's not just him. We're seeing more experts and organizations calling for more transparency in how votes are counted.
Yeah, people are becoming more aware of these weaknesses, and there's a growing demand for better safeguards.
But it can't just be about recounts, right? What other things can we do to make our voting systems more secure?
Well, first off, we need to make sure those voting machines are never connected to the internet, completely offline. And they should use paper ballots that can be audited. So there's a physical record of each vote.
Like a backup in case something's off with the electronic counts.
Exactly. We also need to be super strict about chain of custody procedures.
Yeah.
Tamper-proof seals, tracking systems, no room for error.
So tighter controls and more transparency at every step.
Exactly. And it's not just about technology. We need to educate voters about the potential for interference.
Yeah.
Teach them how to spot those red flags, like those bullet ballots Spoonamore talked about.
So they can speak up if they see something suspicious.
Right. Informed voters are one of our best defenses.
So it sounds like we need a combination of things.
Yeah.
Technological safeguards, stricter procedures, and more awareness from voters.
Absolutely. It's a group effort to protect our elections.
Spoonamore's letter has definitely gotten people talking, which is a good thing.
It's a wake-up call.
It is.
We can't be complacent when it comes to our democracy.
And it's a call to action for all of us to be more vigilant, demand accountability, and do everything we can to protect our right to vote.
Well said. The future of our democracy might depend on it.
That's a heavy thought. This deep dive has really given us a lot to think about.
Yeah.
It really does make you think, doesn't it?
It does. This whole situation really makes you question a lot of things about how elections work, like how secure they really are.
Yeah, we hear about hacking and stuff all the time.
Right.
But you kind of always assume it's like this distant threat.
Yeah.
Something that happens in movies, not something that could actually affect a presidential election.
You're right. It's easy to think it can't happen here. But Spoonamore's letter, it really makes you face the possibility that our systems are way more vulnerable than we think they are.
And then the question becomes, what do we do about it? How do we protect our elections and make sure something like this never happens again? What are the concrete things we can do to make absolutely sure every vote is counted right and that our elections are actually free and fair?
Well, Spoonamore really drove home the importance of hand recounts.
Yeah.
He sees them as, absolutely vital for checking those electronic vote totals, especially when there's any reason to think there might have been some manipulation.
Right, and he's not the only one saying this. We're seeing more and more experts and organizations calling for recounts and demanding more transparency in how votes are counted.
Exactly. There's definitely a growing awareness of these problems, and there's a real push for stronger safeguards.
But recounts can't be the only answer, right?
Yeah.
What other things can we do to make our voting systems more secure? What are some of the concrete solutions people are talking about?
Well, one of the most fundamental things is making sure those voting machines are never, ever connected to the internet. Good. Completely offline, no exceptions. And they should use paper ballots that can be audited if needed. That way, you always have a physical record of every vote that can be checked against those electronic counts.
So it's like a backup plan, a way to double-check things if something seems fishy with the electronic results.
Exactly. And we also need to get really serious about those chain of custody procedures, like tamper-proof seals, rigorous tracking systems, no room for error at all.
So tighter controls, more transparency, more accountability at every step of the way.
Precisely. But technology is only part of it. We need to educate voters about the potential for interference in elections, Give them the tools to spot red flags, like those statistically improbable bullet ballots that Spoonamore was talking about.
Right, so if voters are more informed and they're paying attention, they can help raise the alarm if something doesn't look right. It's like a crowdsourced security system.
Exactly. A well-informed public is one of the best defenses against election interference.
So it sounds like it's going to take a multi-pronged approach. Technological safeguards, tougher procedures, and a more informed and engaged public to really protect our elections from these threats.
Absolutely. It's a team effort for sure. We all have a role to play in making sure our democracy stays strong and resilient.
This whole deep dive has been a real eye-opener, Spoonamore's letter has sparked a conversation that we really need to be having as a society.
It's definitely a wake-up call, reminding us that we can't afford to be complacent when it comes to our democracy.
It's a call to action for all of us to be more vigilant, more demanding of accountability from our leaders, and more willing to do whatever it takes to protect our democracy.
Couldn't have said it better myself. The future of our democracy could very well depend on it.
That's a powerful thought. Well, this deep dive has definitely given us a lot to think about, that's for sure. And to everyone listening out there, thanks for joining us on this journey. It's been fascinating, even though it's a little unsettling at times. Remember, this conversation doesn't end here. Stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged, because the future of our democracy depends on all of us.